Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you find yourself watching this webinar. We hope you're doing well. We're excited to have you all here with us today to talk about how we are thriving in a new era of globalization. As always, we encourage you to use the chat to ask any questions during the session. Additionally, a recording of the session will be shared afterwards, so you'll be able to come back to it if you find that you want to remember what we talked about here today. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Gbsn CEO Dan Leclair. Dan?
Thanks so much, Emma. We really appreciate the intro, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. If you're new to GBSN, just want to say a quick word about who we are. We're a network of about 110 plus leading business schools working with business, NGOs, governments all over the world to improve leadership, management, entrepreneurship in and for the developing world. We're happy you're here to join us for this cross-border webinar. We have lots of different types of webinars. This one is one of my favorites. It's conversational. And the whole idea, the reason why we started this was that I'm a lucky person. I have the opportunity to talk with smart, experienced people every day about topics that matter in business education and in business. And the thought just occurred to us in the context of COVID, actually, that, you know, why not just invite our community to join us, to listen in, to ask a few questions and to participate in the conversation. So I do encourage you to post questions, thoughts, ideas in the chat. We'll try to engage those questions throughout and work from there. But as I mentioned, I get a chance to talk with a lot of smart, experienced people. This is no exception at all. In fact, I've been looking forward to this conversation with Arindam Bhattacharya. I'm not sure I say that right, but I'm gonna, that'll be the last time I say it, I hope, Arindam, throughout the conversation. But he comes to us from BCG. That's all I'm gonna say right now, because I'm gonna start the conversation and start by exploring a little bit, Arindam, your career. If I recall correctly, you graduated from an IIT in India, very fine, selective institutions, and then went on to earn an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad. Again, a very fine, selective institution. And you have a PhD from Warwick in manufacturing engineering. And then you started your career, I think there was some initial work, but started your consulting career at A.T. Kearney, if I remember right.
That's right. That's right.
And then for the last 20 years, you've been at BCG. And it's been a storied career at BCG, the way I understand. One of the things that I'm curious about is that you co-founded something called the Henderson Institute. And I'd love for us to start there, because I think, at least amongst the people that we work closely with, the Henderson Institute is not only very important, but also very similar in some ways to what business schools do. Tell us about the Henderson Institute and why you founded it.
So it's not that thinking or innovation was not happening in BCG, around new concepts, new ideas, but they were all scattered and fragmented within the different practices. And more what we are finding is practices were focusing much more on the short term and the immediate opportunities around pushing ideas. And given all the different things that were happening around the world, and particularly what I call the converging of technology, converging of some of the societal issues, converging of the kind of geopolitics, there were a significant set of themes which impacted competitive advantage of companies, and they were more medium to longer term. And the Henderson Institute was really, in some sense, set up to do two things. One, centralize and bring together and now BCG had reached some scale, bring together a platform where you could create some scale and some what I call institutional memory and capacity to be able to push thinking around this rather than getting fragmented all around the firm. And second is really create a platform where the firm as a firm we could push on ideas which may not have immediate commercial kind of benefits, which the practice areas were more interested in, but also position BCG in thought leadership space, but also create new opportunities for BCGs in the medium to longer term. So that's really the genesis.
Great,
And
great.
I think since then we have come a pretty long way. I mean, BHI is doing, I really do think that is doing a great job.
Yeah, well, I certainly pay attention to the thought leadership coming out of the Henderson Institute. Now, you're an alumni fellow of the Henderson Institute as well as a co-founder. But let's get back to your core job, I guess is the way you might describe it. You had led the India office, but you also, the way I understand it, helped co-found the Global Advantage work that at BCG. Tell us about the Global Advantage work.
So it was, I think, 2003 and 4, based in India, and with some of my colleagues in the US and in China, we started kind of seeing two phenomena. One is that, there were a lot of these companies coming out of the emerging markets, which were taking leadership position in either product category or even in an industry. And, that was a very interesting phenomenon. And secondly, a lot of our clients started asking us and engaging with us around topics like global sourcing, how to set up R&D. In fact, I remember, one of the first projects I did was around setting up a huge sourcing office for one of the automotive giants in China. I then worked on setting up the first international R&D center for this European automation company in India. There was another industrial giant of the US which said that, look, we need to start thinking about creating a backroom center in India or partnering with someone where we can significantly reduce our kind of back office costs. So these were questions, and there was something else that means going on, and that was really the genesis. We started discussing, and at that time it was all about how the new models or waves of globalization of sourcing, manufacturing, services, IT were all coming together, and we started talking about it. We started writing about it, and that became then the basis for the Global Advantage practice. How do you create advantage through a global operations for a company?
That's a great place to begin our discussion about this book, Beyond Great, which you're a co-author of. And I think a lot of our discussion will revolve around the ideas, the strategies discussed in that book. But I want to go back to your first book, because it seems like your first book, called Globality, was both inspired by and helped inform your work on this global advantage. In fact, I remember when the book came out, I didn't know you at the time, Arindam, but I remember the book came out with a very bold sort of subtitle, right? It was Globality. And if I want to make sure I get this right. It was competing with everyone from everywhere for everything. And it struck me at that time that we're in for a really big set of changes when it comes to globalization. But if I remember the core correctly, and I hope you can give us some insight into this, the idea was that in the developing world, there was a lot of up and coming business. And the thought was that the context of globalization will change as a consequence. Tell us just maybe one anecdote about that book that you think is particularly interesting, then we'll build from there.
So it was just striking in some sense. I still remember, I was presenting in India to a visiting head of international for one of the large US chemical companies. And he made a comment, he made two comments. One was Wall Street had been asking them, what's their emerging market strategy? I mean, the whole emerging market was a hot kind of strategic arena for all Western companies. And second was, he said that there are more and more of my peers I see who get completely blindsided by the kind of suddenly the challenges coming out of these countries who are hitting us in our home markets. Chemicals may not be so much, but in industrial companies, it was becoming quite, apparent that many of the Western companies, and we've seen this industry after industry, many of the Western companies had just not kind of anticipated the rise of these, what we call the challenges, and how with the advantage of low cost. And also, I mean, many of them had learned about technology, about business processes from the interaction with the more developed companies from the more developed countries. I mean, they had improved by leaps and bounds, and they had become aspirational going out of the market. So there was, to us, this was a very interesting, fertile ground to talk about the stories of these companies, how they think, how they are completely kind of, rewiring themselves to be able to compete, not in the home markets, but in the global markets. So that's what led to the tagline that, they are competing with you for everything. They are competing with you for talent. They are competing with you for market. So you better be ready. And the audience was largely the Western readers that and Western leadership of companies, that it's no more a Western company dominated market. It is becoming a much more global playground.
Right, and it's very interesting, and I can imagine you and your co-authors sitting as this book was published and begins to get traction and people begin to understand it, but then again realizing that globalization is changing, right? In fact, I think I can imagine in the decade since that book was published, really getting through your work with not only large industrial companies, but companies in this new space of globalization, these insights coming along. But this eventually led to Beyond Great, right? I want to connect the dots though. What was happening since then? I think in the book you mentioned three powerful forces that are sort of shaping the way global companies are thinking and globalization in general. Tell us about those three forces, and then we'll sort of dig into the strategies that you've seen companies use.
So if you look at the history of globalization, I mean, two forces in some sense have shaped it. The one force has been the force of multilateralism, the growth, and how they set the rules of the game. And the other force has been fundamentally technology and technology development, which has progressively kind of removed the barriers to cross-border flow of goods and services, but also reduced the cost of this goods and services traveling distances. For goods, it was container and faster ships. For services, it was the growth of internet. And also the internet had also allowed what you'll call long distance sharing and management of kind of manufacturing facilities and supply chains, because for the first time you could do that at a cost that made it competitive. So that had been the two forces. Geopolitics was not really an important element of that, simply because the whole world economic structure was kind of, in some sense, underpinned by the US hegemony and the US leadership of all these multilateral institutions. Now, we all know that in this growth, where the global trade as a percentage of global GDP, at the start of the 20th century was perhaps around 10%, had grown to nearly 60% by end of the 20th century had also created a lot of fault lines. But as when the growth was at that pace, I mean, the fault lines were covered because there was a much bigger pie to share. The moment economic crisis happened and the pie shrank, then everyone started grabbing for their share of the pie, and that actually exposed the fault lines that the globalization had created enormous wealth, but there was clearly a mismatch in the division of the wealth that happened, particularly in the Western economies, and that
The
created
inequality, the inequality.
that happened, and then the fault lines were visible, and that led to this whole these three forces coming together. At the same time, you had the next wave of technological innovation through digital growth or digital technologies, of IoT on the shop floor factories, but all kinds of digital technologies and growth of data, and data can travel much more easily than goods and services. So I still remember that in 2015 I was attending the World Economic Forum Davos, and I read one of the internal kind of newsletter. We said globalization is dead, and to me from India, I said there is something wrong. I mean, globalization is not dead. I mean, we are still so very positive, but there is something else happening, and that started the research, and that led to this book, which is really in some sense. There are two kind of centripetal and centrifugal forces at play, and this time the force of also societal force. The tensions that is there in societal society is also becoming in some sense a player in the forces that is shaping globalization. Besides geopolitics and multilateralism, which was weakening, and the force of technology, which was also shaping. The cost of goods and services and data that would flow across borders. So that was the basis. And we said, look, if this is the case, then the economic logic of how do you compete and how do you build a global business is changing. And that's really what the book set out to do, understand the economic logic and what is the new playbook.
Those societal forces that you talk about, these are things like the climate crisis and growing inequality within countries, those types of social kinds of issues, social economic, they're not just social.
No, absolutely.
In addition to, yeah.
If you were to think about, say, 1980 or 90 and talk to a CEO or the leadership team or even boards, they always saw some of the societal divisions which has always existed, not as part of their responsibility. I mean, they don't need to do anything. It's the government's responsibility to do it. They're paying taxes. But more and more, it became very apparent that unless we find a way as society and the kind of ecosystem, businesses and government work together to address some of these issues, and these will act as roadblocks to the basic growth of the global economy. Mm-hmm. And that is why there is, and also I think some of the excesses of capitalism started becoming very apparent. So that is why purpose and what is the role of business and the business roundtable, it just really started talking about what's the role of company in addressing some of the societal issues, which is around sustainability, which is around diversity, which is around some of the communities that they work in, and in how do you help the communities and so on. So these were issues that had becoming, that actually had led to anti-globalization movements becoming, or economic national movements becoming more and more prominent. And of course, that acted as dampeners to economic growth.
Well, any single one of those dimensions is very complicated by itself. But when you pull all of that together, the societal issues, the social tension, the economic nationalism, the technological advances and transformations, all of that is very, very complex. And one of the things I've always admired about experienced consultants like yourself is the ability to bring all that together in a model, in a way that both leverages their experience, but also helps to communicate about how companies are doing this. And I find this a strength of Beyond Great. In fact, my colleagues often give me a hard time because I work in groups of 3, it seems. And in your book, you bring your experience together with companies and what they're doing together in a 3x3 in some sense.
Yes.
I wonder if you could, give us just a quick overview of that framework, which I find very useful. Then I'd like to spend the rest of the time drilling down a little bit, in particular in 3 areas. But could you give us, is it possible without a PowerPoint slide to give us an overview of that model?
Absolutely. That was one of the hard things to do because, the book is not so much the typical management consultants write, which is much more of a hypothesis-driven, approach. You have a set of ideas, and then you do a lot of research, and then you prepare a framework, and you have a lot of data behind kind of justifying the framework that you're proposing as a new model or new strategy or and so on and so forth. This book is remarkably different from that, because in the sense that this is based on distilling, in some sense, insights and essence from, I personally must have interviewed about nearly 50, 60 CEOs and CXOs, and we built case studies about 200 odd companies who we believed are doing something very interesting. And out of that, we distilled these 9 strategies. But in some sense, I would say these 9 strategies are paradigm shifts of how companies are looking at fundamentally changing the way they had been doing things earlier. So I would like to just draw 2 things. And before I come to the 9 strategies, one is, it is not that all the companies have to do all 9, but these are the 9 paradigm shifts, or we can call it strategies, that we distilled from all the interviews and case studies. As it so happens, and it's a kind of a happy coincidence that there are 9 of them, and all the 9 fitted very nicely in 3 buckets. One is to do with growth. One set is to deal with growth, one set is to deal with operations, and one set is to deal with organization and culture. And put together, what we call is creating the playbook for moving from being a great company to being a company that is today at the cutting edge in this new era being shaped by the 3 forces. Now, I'll not go through all 9 because it will take a lot of time, but I'll just go through maybe 1 or 2 of them, which is, I was particularly struck, and I'm sure when you read it, you would have particularly struck with the first chapter, and do go beyond. And one would wonder, social kind of CSR kind of activities is always there, but is that really something that can drive growth? And the examples that we are given in companies, and from a mining company to automation company to a financial services company, and then Natura, the Brazilian cosmetics company, each one of them has put a different, what I'll call kind of aspect of total societal impact into core of the business to drive growth. Mining company, the senior executive we spoke to, she said, no, this is the license to operate. If we do not do that, if we don't work with our community and help them improve their economic standing, it's not just kind of doing some training and building a school. It is actually working with them as a partner to improve the economic standing. We will not have a license to operate in that community. And that is what we are doing. That's Anglo-American. They're an early stage of that model, and we'll have to see how it works out. But it just shows the thinking change that is today helping them think about what is the business all about. And that's what they think will unlock markets for them compared to some of the competitors who probably are not doing it as well or as deeply. So that was, and to me, this is a paradigm shift. I mean, you move from just talking about and doing maximizing total shareholder returns to maximizing societal impact, including shareholders, return to shareholder. So each one of them actually chapter, this is one, the second one talks about what, how do you have to redefine products and services to talk about solutions, because that's where the growth is. And every company that we have, this is one dimension that most companies have progressed further. But then they, and one of the most interesting companies, and which recently announced actually they have completely changed their organizational model, is John Deere, and how they have put what they call a farming solutions at the core of the business rather than just selling tractors and harvesters. Right. And the day, actually interesting, the day they announced it, their stock price after within weeks had increased by nearly 70%. So really they are being rated now as a tech stock rather than just as an old line industrial stock. Mm-hmm. So we derived these three these 9 strategies, and in the operations side, one of the things that I would draw your attention to was the last phase of globalization that we, and I kind of deal with in my book, Globality, is all about low cost as being the basis of advantage for a lot of companies. And if you have the Indian IT companies, which we featured there, which is TCS, their whole basis was having very large, what they call industrialized IT delivery centers. But if you look at TCS today, I mean, while they still have a fairly large centers in India, they have over 200 centers around the world. These are completely networked. They can shift work across these centers seamlessly using a cloud management services, and they combine different skills and cost structures to be able to deliver a solution. So it's no more just plain vanilla, low cost industrialized service. It is becoming more and more customized solutions delivered through a global network. And that is the model we believe companies and industrial companies as well are moving towards, which is a completely different way to think about how do you build a global manufacturing advantage rather than just deal with low cost. So that's one. On the organizational side, I was struck. I mean, I had gone to China for about nearly 10 days and had a chance to meet dozens of companies just to understand how they are dealing with these 3 forces. And one of the most interesting companies, which has been at least last year was in news for the wrong reason, was ByteDance. The man, the kind of producer, the owner of TikTok.
Yeah.
Outstanding company. They have over 50,000 employees. Maybe growing faster now. That they had 50,000 employees kind of 2 years ago when I met them. They still operate as a startup. They do not operate, and the word they use was, we want to keep our company liquefied. They work on liquefied.
Yeah.
So they work in short-term projects and what they call sprints. Every employee knows what the others are doing. The KPIs are transparent from the CEO down. Each one of them works on multiple projects at the same time. They choose what projects they work, and it is all kind of complex, this kind of organizational model seamlessly knit together by a digital, you can call a nervous system. So to me, the way the whole concept of how do you make an organization not just bureaucratic, but in some sense liquid, fluid, agile, much more customer focused, is a huge paradigm shift. You are moving away from trying to gain efficiency to becoming much more speed and customer focused. So as I kind of get 3 illustrations of very different paradigm shifts, and this is what we try to bring out in the book with the richness of the examples to support them.
Yeah, and it's interesting that technology plays a role across all of those examples that you described. Now, in the three categories, you talked about a couple of examples in the growth category, and then you skip to the organizational category. But right there in the middle, you have some strategies that are evolving in terms of operations. You talk about,
Yes.
and one of them, I think you referenced a little bit, was ecosystems, right? So the way you engineer an ecosystem, right?
Absolutely.
But the another one is what you describe as let the data run through it. This is how you titled the chapter, and to me, this is an interesting place. You talked a little bit about the growth in terms of doing good. And I want to come back to that a little bit, especially as I get to the last one. But I want to focus a little bit on this data. You know, I had a conversation just the other day from a person in a large executive search firm. They do a lot more than executive search now, but the conversation revolved around something like the following, that you know, in automobiles, we're not talking about cars anymore, right? We're talking about mobility. And the way she described this experience from an executive point of view is that this convergence between sort of manufacturing or products and software, right? And that everything now sort of revolves around, when we talk about mobility, around software and delivering services. So we had a nice chat about playing games in autonomous vehicles, right? So you still got to get place to place, but you don't have to drive anymore. Now we play games. So the question is, how do you deliver gaming or entertainment in the context of mobility? So all of these things are changing, and I know I'm sort of rambling on about things that you have sort of a nice sense of, but talk to us a little bit about this idea about data. I think in one place you write about instead of shipping it, stream it. And
Yes.
Another place you talk about the importance of data in terms of operations. Help us get some clarity about what's happening in this space of IoT and software convergence with hardware, but things like that. I know it's a big question, right? You could go on about, but
You know, again, as part of the research, I spent some time in Silicon Valley and talked to a bunch of people. And one of the most insightful comments, which was came out in an interview with this person who is really one of the leading big data experts in the world. He said, data used to be an exhaust. Data used to be an exhaust of management processes. So you did something, and then to measure it, you kind of data came up, and then you created dashboards or whatever. I mean, data was an exhaust of some activity. Now, or value creating activity. Now, you can create value from data. So data is becoming the fuel, and all digital companies actually create a solution which is customized to you using data. And they can influence your behavior so that you buy that solution. So in some sense, data has become the fuel, and that is a huge paradigm shifts. Now, digital companies and a lot of these startups, they are what we call a digital natives. They think in terms of how do you construct a new solution, how do you construct a new solution that addresses certain pain points using data, digital connectivity, and so on and so forth. What are the industrial companies? Now, industrial companies, for industrial companies today, these kind of digital solutions which are layered onto their hardware is the fastest growing business. So, you know, Siemens has something called the digital factory business, which is really about these digital solutions, which is sold to their customers after the product is sold. So that is the fastest growing business. And there are all kinds of different solutions, and they have created their own kind of a platform in which they can analyze these kind of data which is coming up from their machines. And this platform is called MindSphere application, MindSphere, and they use that application, that platform to create these solutions. Now, the change that we have seen was earlier, the whole mindset was, okay, data comes up, we measure it, and then we go back and change something in the process. Today, companies like Siemens or Schneider, we have put 4 or 5 companies, John Deere, Siemens, Schneider, and even a startup, they look at this as a way to create or target new revenue pools and to create competitive advantage. So that's the big shift. But then you need to figure out a way how your physical supply chain and your digital supply chain are designed and can complement each other. So they can't be too separate. They have to work together with each other, because where's the data coming from? Now, again, Siemens uses a very interesting term called intelligent hardware. So you have to design the hardware to be intelligent, to kind of bring out the data, which can then be used to create, using algorithms to create the kind of solution which could be around improving the uptime of a machine, to predicting when the next failure will happen, to improving the kind of telling the operator that you need to change some parameters or operations of the machine to be able to give you better productivity or better quality, and so on and so forth. These are all solutions which, but you need that data that can come in. It can also combine with all other kind of data. For example, if you take tractors, the tractor throws up a lot of data from the sensors which are there in the tractors on say fuel consumption, or on the plows of what is the quality of moisture in the soil, and at what depth are you planting the seeds, to weather data which is more public, to pricing data which is more public, to go into the algorithm which then the farmer uses to decide on when to plant, what time to plant, what depth to plant, to be able to maximize his profit per hectare of farmland. So that's a very different way. But then you need to start putting the customer and start thinking like the customer would think, and construct your whole value proposition customer back rather than product out.
Hence the John Deere as a tech company, right?
That's why John Deere has become more of a seeing itself more as being seen as more as a tech company rather than just making plows and tractors and harvesters.
Yeah, that's perfect. That example or series of examples really does help illustrate how technology and data and digitalization is changing the way we think about this. In fact, going back to this conversation, the reason why we're having this conversation was because from their point of view at this executive search firm, the most difficult talent, they say, to find has been the sort of the combination of software knowledge, expertise, and experience combined with design, all sort of brought together with leadership skills, right? So as an executive, they're saying that these people simply do not exist in large numbers. The software engineers don't have the leadership skills. The design folks don't have the software capacity. And so we had a conversation about this, and one of the things that we talked about, just as an example, is typically in MBA education, for example, you might get an undergraduate engineering degree, right? Go do engineering for 3 years, but then you're assigned to be a team lead, and then eventually you get your MBA, right? And then you really don't do much engineering after that. Right now, it's a little bit different. But what I heard, for example, about software engineering is that people were reluctant to stop doing software engineering, because even 3 months out of the workforce means you lose your cutting edge capacity, right? So stopping to get an MBA is less common as a consequence. So we had a nice chat about this, but this all leads me to my favorite chapter in the whole book, right? And the title of the chapter is Thrive with Talent, right? And you can see why, our community is really so interested in your experiences as it relates to not only the strategies, but the talent part of those strategies. And maybe you could take us inside that chapter a little bit and talk with us a little bit about, number one, what you've observed in terms of the importance of talent and the challenges associated with that, but then some strategies that you see happening on the business side, so that we can begin to think about, well, what can we do on the education side that might help address some of those challenges?
That's a extremely important question, and I'm going to be somewhat controversial here for your audience. One of the interesting questions that I asked, I'll not name whom, a friend of mine who was at that time, one of the leading business school professors and leaders. Would you design the business school, the way they're designed today? And if you have to design from scratch, and she said, probably no. And I said, why? She said, look, for us, particularly in leading schools, we don't have an incentive to change radically. But the world has moved on, and the way the businesses now conceptualize and deliver value is very different from the way they used to deliver value. As an example, while you still need the skills of, say, some of the skills of marketing or finance, I mean, really more and more, I mean, as an entrepreneur, you need, and more of businesses or value creation is being driven by startups which grow up. And, as if you want to be an entrepreneur, you need a set of skills which are not just functional skills, you need a set of skills which are much more integrative skills. And that's one of the challenges of both engineering and also business, because increasingly value creation is happening not in the core, but in the periphery and in the overlap of industries. For example, value creation is a combination of hard and soft skills. Value creation is happening in combination of design engineering and software skills. Value creation is happening in looking at the solution from the customer's perspective, which is not just a product, but it requires a lot of other kind of knowledge. So how do you create this set of integrative skills which are very critical for business? That is one dimension. The second dimension is, in today's particular technology, fast-paced change, you teach a skill, within, say, a year, that skill becomes redundant. And you cannot keep on training and teaching. So you have moved back completely from push-based training to a pull-based training. And someone needs to get into a project or needs to get into a role which requires certain kind of skills. They get into a program to build that skills. They'll move into a different kind of a role. They'll get into a program to build the next set of skills. And these are all a combination of online and offline. But they are dynamic and they are real time. So it is not that once you've had a kind of training program, you are done. That whole model. And that was one of the examples we describe in the book, particularly in the way Indian IT companies, which hire tens of thousands of employees every year, used to train their employees. Today, they have completely changed the model to become a from push-based to a pull-based model based on a certain requirements for different customer projects or solutions. If you don't have cloud, but you're going to a cloud-based projects, you learn the cloud-based technologies. If you go into something else, you learn that technology and that programming. And that's how it's happening. The
Mhm.
third question, which is why talent is becoming very important, is the expectations of our young people are changing dramatically. And we speak about they are not interested in careers and long careers, and the roles. They are more experienced, interested in kind of getting more interesting experience, particularly before they have, say, families, and they are wanting to experiment. They want to have a better balance, work-life balance. So the question for companies is, if you want to attract this talent, I mean, how do you create an environment which gives them multiple experiences rather than just forces them into a box? And putting all of it together, really, in some sense, you are talking about a very different talent paradigm. And my view is, all educational institutions actually need to think about it, and that is why the lots of corporates are starting to think about corporate universities, because that's the only way you can create this dynamic talent kind of upgradation that is required in today's environment.
Yeah, well, we're certainly seeing a lot of change in that, in this overall paradigm shift. I like the way you describe it. It's, the days where you get as much education as possible early in life and then kind of reap the benefits throughout, those days are gone, right? We need to learn over a lifetime. And I know you addressed that in the chapter, but there's one part in the chapter that I found really interesting. And I'm going to give you an example. I talked to a talent person at a large cloud services company, and it was really like a lot of things I talk about, it revolving around this talent question in education and development. And he said something that intrigued me. He didn't clarify, but he said something that was provocative to me. He said, look, when we hire people, they bring their clients, right? He said something to that effect, that we don't really hire people unless they have already clients. And I asked a fellow I know at a different company, in this case, more of a straight technology company, about this, and he says what he's talking about is talent acquisition, or talent recruitment through acquisition is what he was talking about. So a lot of companies now are really buying other companies, really less for the technology and for the innovation, and more for the talent. And I recall in your chapter you had these 3 B's, right? This was one of the B's. The other B's being building. This one's called buying, borrowing, and bridging. Because this insight to me really gives us a lot of knowledge to work with on the education side. Right? How do we bridge this gap between what talent we have and the talent needed by business at any given moment? You don't have to go through all the B's, but I'm wondering if you could just tell me about the building B and the borrowing B in addition to the buying.
So the building is the traditional way you would develop talent, which is hire and then train and upgrade the skills, and that has always been the traditional way that you do. Buying is exactly what you said. A lot of companies, particularly in the tech space, but otherwise also look at acquiring talent through the acquisitions. They are not just acquiring customers through acquisitions or capable, but also specific talent. And but to me, one of the most interesting models is borrowing. And I still remember, a couple of years ago, as part of, again, some of the interviews that I did, I was talking to the CEO of one of the tech companies, and he said, look, we had got a project from a client and we realized we don't have that specific skills. And which was required, one specific skill that was required for building a certain program for the solution. And to hire someone and then train them, or even to kind of get someone who's the right kind of skills would be very difficult, because that was a very specialized programming skills, which was not very common. So he said, as an experiment, what we did was we developed a module and we put it out into on our website and the net for people to kind of compete and give it, and we gave a prize for anyone who could kind of complete that module and send us a solution. He said we didn't expect any results, or maybe some crackpots will see this and maybe do something. He said we were absolutely overwhelmed. There were so many responses, and we had a choice of which are the ones we took, and then we created them. And so it was not so much they were looking at the money, they wanted to solve that problem. And we got some really, really great programmers from Russia, from Estonia, from some Eastern European countries, who there were some very, very strong programmers who want to work freelance. And the question therefore is, can you borrow them for a specific way, and how do you kind of engage them? And I found that interesting, because most companies always look at talent internally. I mean, they rarely look at kind of this kind of talent who could come in on a project basis, or even for a short term, not just project, and solve some of the challenges that they face. So that is boring.
I love that. In fact, it informs some of the work that we do at the Global Business School Network. We're in the business of defining problems through which students compete, right? And the idea is that, if you come up with a good problem, it's like honey to bees, right? The great talent is attracted by great problems to solve, and this is important. I'm going to just make a comment, and then I want to turn to a question. There are a couple of questions that popped up in there. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but I want to sort of tie things together a little bit, if we could, Arindam. The chapter on talent spends a good deal of time with purpose, where we started, right? We started with this do good idea, and the thought now is that if you want to attract talent, it's not just great problems, but a great purpose. And maybe you want to make a comment on that before we turn to one or two of the questions that have popped up. You want to sort of tie this together in some way?
To me, purpose, and before that, mission, vision, they were often words until two things happened. Until the big funds started putting some money where their mouth was. I mean, you had a lot of funds earlier, and I'm not talking about purpose, but I'm talking about things that you do for empowering or impacting society. So more and more funds and the money is being influenced by ESG. And that is one thing that has started changing the behavior of companies. But the other, and to me, the more important thing is the question that you raised, which is increasingly there are large parts of population, particularly in more developed economies, where young population who make choices. Who make choices are the kind of companies that they work with, and choices are the companies that don't want to work with. And it aligns with, what I'll call the purpose, and aligns with what they think is the responsibility of a business to the society. And therefore, and it's not just hollow. I mean, we were told, for example, in both interviews with MasterCard, with Natura, with Unilever, that once they kind of integrated purpose into their talent hiring and management and into their way of working, their attractiveness at campuses and attractiveness on job sites and attractiveness to young people has increased significantly, and the retention has improved. So there is clear metric to show that young people care. Young people care, and they can also see through any superficial kind of stuff that you do. So they care, and the good companies are trying to convert that into some kind of advantage for themselves.
Thank you for that, Arindam. I want to apologize to the audience because I haven't left enough time for all of the questions that have popped up. So maybe we can go through these fairly quickly. But really interesting question I think you deal with in one of the chapters pretty explicitly, and that's the optimal balance between global integration and national responsiveness. And I think you're really pointed to this, and I think it's around chapter 6. You want to make a comment on that, Arindam?
Can you
global integration and national responsiveness? And I think a lot of it's driven by this idea that many countries have discovered they didn't have the supply chain built in a way that helps them in a time of a crisis, right? That's not the only thing, but you point to economic nationalism as being one of the factors companies need to consider in building resilient supply chains, for example.
So there are many nuances to this question, but let me try and see if I can get through it in a couple of minutes. One is what the Unilever CEO told us in the interview. He said one of the questions that not just Unilever, but every consumer companies are facing today in every market is, or all the large markets, is there is a very strong local competitors. These strong local competitors, they are very nimble. They respond to consumer changes, need changes very, very quickly. They go into the market with new products, but they also equally fast get out of the market if the product doesn't succeed. So their whole model is centered around speed and responsiveness. Whereas a global company's whole model is centered around global scale and efficiency, which is why they build this fairly monolithic kind of organizational model. And he says that is something that we have to break. And it's not very easy when you have more than 100 years of culture behind that kind of global headquarter-driven model. And that is why companies like Unilever are completely overturning their model to giving much more responsibility and authority to local teams to be able to respond very quickly. That is one dimension. The second dimension is economic nationalism is making companies, it becoming more expensive to import products. And often it is not just cost, it is also policy saying that if you do not invest in the country, then the government say will penalize you or not, will let you enter. So to build, for particularly large markets, a completely kind of, in some sense, integrated model within the country is becoming very critical, not for both for regulatory requirements, but also for cost requirements. So both these forces, being local for local and creating local ownership of the customer in terms of decision rights, are playing out. And that is how you manage the global scale with local responsiveness and local supply chain.
Thanks for addressing that. Unfortunately, we're actually out of time. How are you doing on time, Arindam? Because several questions have
so we can go on for another 5 minutes, and then I just need to.
So why don't I put off one person asked for book recommendations. How about if we agree to follow up with some additional recommendations when we send out the video, perhaps, and maybe get your ideas about that. But I want to get to this question about inequalities. Big tech companies are accentuating more and more inequality. Will it be possible in the future to have more and more growth, but less inequalities? You know, this maybe goes beyond what you were talking about when you talk about beyond great for companies. But I'm wondering, you know, what your thoughts about that? You're in the middle of this in a lot of ways because you're helping companies to grow and develop, but at the same time, you're experiencing some of the pushback in terms of social tension. What do you think about this?
There's a complicated question, and a question which is what I'll call, yes, it is right in the center of some of the raging debates that's happening, that the benefits of growth has been divided unequally. In fact, and in fact, the technology today, it's not just the digital technologies, but other technologies, and with the value creation shifting more and more to IP rather than to kind of producing nuts and bolts, widgets in the shop floor. The owners of IP and the funders of IP are in some sense getting disproportionate kind of returns compared to those who work on the shop floor. That's the reality, and that is reality reflected in the growing inequality and the concentration of wealth. Now, my mind, there are two very, very fundamental challenges that we need to solve if we want to solve both the problems of growth and growing inequality. One is there has to be a way that policymakers in every country find a way of distributing or having a better redistributed policies. And there's a big pushback which is happening with digital companies. You try to tax them, they are pushing back. And there is a digital kind of a bipolar with China and US cornering the benefits from the digital growth. That is one part. The second, I think, issue is technology is becoming the big driver for a new value creation and in some sense surplus, and that is concentrated again in few hands or in fewer places. And how do you make that those benefits more universal? Now, I don't have an answer to that. I do believe that we have an opportunity, and to me, I mean, we either way we have a lose-lose opportunity, or we can create a win-win. But unfortunately, sometimes in this kind of situation, countries and companies look at it only from their position, winning position, rather than in the way how they can create and that a more winning world. And if I look back between say 1980 to period of around 2005, and that was one of the biggest drivers of growth, which was multilateralism, which grew the pie and which created enough surplus. Unfortunately, the surplus was not well distributed and created these divisions. I just hope that the opportunity that we have with the power of technology and digital to create value, we don't, in some sense, lose that power by again failing to support it with the right economic policy within the country.
Well, thank you. And it was a really tough question, but it's a great positive way, because what I heard you say is that it is possible to have more growth, faster growth, and be more inclusive and reducing inequality at the same time. But it's hard, and it involves public-private collaboration as well as democratization of technology. What that win-win, I think, is what we're all aiming for. And unfortunately, we're out of time. Boy, next time we'll have to schedule this conversation for a little bit longer. Arindam, it's been a pleasure, a privilege, actually, to have you with the GBSN community talking about your insights from the field, but also how you synthesize those in this book, which I do highly recommend. To me, it creates order out of chaos in many ways as it relates to business. So thank you again, Arindam. Thank you all for joining us, and please do look forward to receiving the video. And we'll try to arrange for some of the questions that were unanswered to get answered somehow in the follow-up. So thank you, Arindam. We appreciate it very much.
And thank you, Dan, and thanks GBSN for this opportunity. I enjoyed it. As you said, I wish it could have gone longer, but I'm sure that we'll get other opportunities.
Sure.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much.